Okay, the lady just told us. Thank you very much. And the way we're going to do this, as you will see throughout this entire session, we're going to go back and forth, Sarah and I. And so I'm going to introduce Sarah and she will introduce me. I think am I going to start, Sarah? Yes?
Yeah.
All right. So with me today is Sarah Watson, who is an extension specialist with the South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium, and she's also with the Carolinas Integrated Sciences and Assessment Program. And she deals in her day-to-day work with climate and resiliency issues and provides really hands-on assistance to communities who are trying to adapt and trying to figure out how to deal with sea level rise, and in particular, beginning now to think about retreat. So her background might also be relevant to this, is she has a master's in public policy and regional planning, and also has worked as a journalist, and in fact worked through Sandy in that capacity. So very much firsthand experience with disasters and adaptation. She lives, feels, thinks, works through the minute details of retreat. So Sarah, one of the things we were going to say is, I guess I wanted to simply ask you if you have heard any cynical or cynical jokes about sea level rise and retreat, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think the common one I get is, well, I hope I'm not going to be the one having to do this, or maybe we'll just all get airboats to get to work. I think that's actually mine. I'll commute by airboat. So I get the honor of introducing Susie, and I feel like I'm not, I'm just going to actually tell everybody what your work has actually meant to me, because I feel like everybody can just Google you, or has already been on at least 2 of your talks already. But I first got to know Susie's work when I was in grad school, right out of working as a journalist, and I was very interested in studying how in the world do you actually communicate about climate change. And I kind of somebody suggested I look at your work, and I did, and then I started reading your works cited, and then I started reading your website, and I started finding all kinds of other stuff, and eventually all of my papers were basically just syntheses of her work, and other people too. Like, don't worry, it wasn't just all you. But over the years, she has been an amazing mentor to me and has really taught me a lot about how to rethink how we're communicating. And it's always interesting that, I will come to her and kind of just go, oh my gosh. And she'll be like, hey, I wrote a paper about it, or I'm thinking about it too. Or we're kind of often on not necessarily the same wavelength, but similar wavelengths. And I think her work has been especially important for those of us who are working on the ground I always talk about that I'm kind of I'm so deep in the weeds that I'm in the mud. And so she's been kind of right there alongside me in a lot of this. And so Susie, what's your cynical comment that you've heard?
Oh, it's all going to just be like Venice. Isn't that wonderful?
I need to send you that video, don't I? Anyway, next slide. Go?
Yeah, getting there.
Yeah, so I like how this turned out. We would love for you all to introduce yourselves. Obviously, we have 45 people in the room already, and we have a very short amount of time. So if you can put in the chat your name and your pronouns, where you're working, where you are. If you want to put your land acknowledgement there, that would be great. And also you too can put in your one dark joke or cynical thing that you've heard about sea level rise or retreat. And we will gradually read that as we're going along. Next slide, Susie.
Yep, coming right up. All right, so I'm going to introduce what we're going to do today. There are really a few themes that we're going to run through this entire day. And we want to talk a little bit about audience and the different needs that audiences have with retreat communication, different challenges that they face, and very much focus on the emotional, the psychological dimension of retreat and what comes up for people, because that is what's in the room, whether you want it or not, whether you want to make this technical or not, you're still going to have all the emotions there. And we're going to address a little bit the idea of how do you frame retreat in a way that doesn't just shut down the conversation and get people just to, lock in and not engage anymore. And so we're going to split this into 3 segments. And the first one is really the best advice that we could come up with as a communicator going into communities, knowing thyself, knowing the audiences, and knowing thy stuff. How do you do that? In the second segment, we're going to talk about sort of the arc of the conversation about retreat, how that might unfold. And just to sort of, preface this by saying this workshop is called Before You Jump Ship, and basically talking about the retreat conversation before you're in the middle of it, right? How do you begin this conversation? Because that's where most of us really are. The third segment is about the need for framing this as a transformation, as a transition, and how in the world are we instilling hope and taking care of ourselves, and maybe even helping our audiences take care of themselves as they go through this difficult process. So that's what we're going to focus on, lots to do. And so with that, just want to say a word about how we're going to do this. I already mentioned we're going to sort of be in this dialogue. Sarah, the worker bee on the front lines with communities very often in just the way she described, what is another word for jump ship? How do I talk about this with my community? And then she comes to me and, I'll try to make my academic sense out of that and try to give her a frame for how to think about it. That's kind of how we're going to go through this. And I invite you to also do the same, right? To sort of look at your own stories, your experiences with that, wherever you have them, whether they're in a particular group, in a particular place, or whether you're working with a network of people working in communities, wherever you are, just sort of, reflect on your own story and try to extract the lessons from that. And I invite you throughout putting your questions into the chat. We're going to have multiple opportunities to do Q&A as we go along. And so we're going to just keep addressing them as we go. So with that, let's start here. And Sarah, I hand it over to you to begin with story.
So I just want to kind of note that I'm going to talk to you about a place where I'm currently working. I am not going to give you the actual full details because we've decided that it's really important not to put too much of a spotlight on this place because we don't want outside publicity to influence people as they're perceiving all of this work as it's beginning to happen. So under the advice of one of my colleagues, we're actually going to use, if any of you are Netflix people, I'm not, we're going to use references from the show Outer Banks. Which is actually filmed in Charleston, which is where I live right now, but takes place in the Outer Banks. But apparently they really mangled geography. So if you want to Google things, you're just not going to find anything. So we're going to use the term Kildare Beach. And a little bit about Kildare Beach. It's an island with about 800 full-time residents. It's a resort town with a history of multiple generations coming from other parts of South Carolina to vacation. Houses are really passed down through through families, but increasingly they're starting to get purchased as shares or as investments for rentals. People come for the quiet and the natural beauty. This is not Myrtle Beach. This is not a big area that people come to party. People come for that natural quiet. People around there have a pretty individualistic worldview and don't want much regulation. Taxes are low, services are very basic, and residents are almost entirely middle to upper income white people. And that's, I think that's pretty common in a lot of places in the South, but then you also have communities that don't have that. But we're going to be talking about this particular example because this is where it's really challenging of how do you work with this kind of population. In February 2020, the administrator from Kildare Beach emailed me asking if I could help them explore the community's risk to sea level rise and flooding in the future. They'd seen a resort I'd co-written, or a report I had co-written with a colleague from the other nearby town, which also was a relatively small community, but also in this situation didn't have the funding or the resources to hire an outside consultant. And we began that initial call to understand what they were looking for and you know, some of the challenges that they were seeing. They had done basically no planning or risk assessment, and they were worried that they were really behind. But they also knew that flooding was occurring more and more frequently. The water was coming from extreme heavy rain just as badly as it was coming from the tides. And they'd also rarely had flooding prior to 2015, when, you know, we had a very extreme storm associated with an offshore hurricane, and that dropped more than 20 inches of rain in parts of coastal South Carolina. Since then, they've really noticed that the tidal flooding occurs multiple times a month. During rainy periods, they can have standing water on roads that lasts for days and actually causes septic system failures. People get really jumpy when they hear forecasts that for flood, you know, weather that could bring flooding. And sometimes people really can't get into their homes without having to walk through this you know, possibly sewage contaminated water. And, you know, now the residents are starting to tell town staff about what they're starting to experience, and they're starting to worry about what that means for the future. So, you know, as we're hearing this, we decided that it would probably be fastest to do a workshop with town staff to really dive into what they're experiencing, working with, you know, what are the town staff starting to see? What are the systems that, you know, they're trying to manage, and how are those getting challenges? And so as we plan to do a workshop in May of 2020, and also my colleagues at the College of Charleston would develop flood modeling for the community. I had not actually been to this place. And so what the plan was, once the model was done, I would visit the town and discuss the observations in person with the administrators. And then obviously, you know, that the world basically shut down in March of 2020. And as part of that, about 2 weeks later, I actually got the results of the flood modeling. And this was the first time that I had actually seen flood modeling results where there was really no good news in this. And I'd already knew that the vulnerable places that they had mentioned were experiencing pretty frequent flooding every month, but I didn't realize how low basically the entire island was, and that it was showing how groundwater was going to emerge as sea level was going to rise. And I'm experienced in communicating the news about vulnerability assessments, and usually you can talk about the strengths along with the weaknesses to keep people from shutting down emotionally. But this was the first time I really couldn't do that. And I was suddenly very nervous, and I also felt like I didn't have enough experience or skill, facilitation skill, in order to do this properly. We finally had the next meeting in April of 2020 via webinar when I showed the administrators the modeling. And I wanted them to see things first so that they could prepare themselves and their staff ahead of that scheduled workshop. We had a lot of really difficult conversations that were really based on observations and experiences. It was very much just the facts. But everything that I had been very anxious about and worried about, all of the bad news, none of it was really a surprise to them because they lived there, they experienced that. And what they really wanted to know was how much time they have and how can they buy time through adaptation. And also they were joking about hoping it's not their job to be the one that has to deal with the problem. We wanted to do this big workshop with town staff in person because there is a lot of emotional work that has to be done. And we were, you know, had to keep postponing it due to COVID. And eventually we did do it over Zoom because we had to get it done. And then during that workshop, we really started to see the deep in the weeds details about the current infrastructure failures and corrosion and other effects that I expected to see in a community in maybe 10 years. And for me, it was actually quite overwhelming. And I actually had trouble sleeping for, you know, a bit afterward because I really couldn't stop thinking about what was actually happening and how soon it seemed. And so I was also worried about what the next part of this would be and whether the report would just basically be attacked or dismissed. Next slide, Susie.
All right, so the way we're going to do this is now I'm going to try to draw out the lessons from what you just heard and group this in the 3 bins here. What Sarah just talked about last, I think maybe is where I want to start. Right? She has her own feelings about loss and endings, you know, whether it's because she loves working on the coast or whether she loves the place or simply because there's a history in, you know, that we all personally hold, right? About how we personally deal with or have encountered endings and loss before, having fears about having the conversation, our own. It's not just, you know, the people we're working with, right? That might be worried about this. It brings up, I think, our ability to let go and really digging into whether or not we have that ability any judgments we might hold. What if they, ignore what I say? What if they, want to, whatever, build seawalls all the way from here to China, right? So what judgments do you hold about what coastal communities might do? And then there might even be something about, God, I so want to help. And I want to be needed, if you will, in this process. She started out with giving you the rundown of at least the place. But, in all these conversations she had, she really needed to learn about what's the preferred language, what resonates with that particular community, what do they not talk about? You don't know this. If you have not lived in that community, you don't necessarily know the culture, the local history. You really have to dig into that before you go in, and to be very mindful of that as you go into engagement with the community. Having some sense of the demographics and how that shapes the conversations. She mentioned working class, lower to middle class in this particular community. Where people sit. I mean, in local communities, the politics are harsh, right? We all know this, that, people hold positions of power that an outsider may not necessarily really be able to see. So learning that takes time. Doing this on a rush, I would never recommend that. What attitudes do people have toward government or climate change? And, what are their social relations internally? And then, of course, you really need to know the stuff, right? Where is sea level rise already impinging and disrupting services? What are the particular social, physical, ecological vulnerabilities? Is there history? What's their experience, for example, with hazards in the past? What, if anything, is happening from climate change already, or what's projected to happen? That's where the modeling came in. And what does that mean? Do never, ever just stop with, just looking at the flood models. What does it mean to a community when certain parts of the community start to flood first, but then you can't maybe reach other parts, or maybe other parts are more protected? What are the dynamics that sets up for the flow of daily day-to-day activities? What adaptation work have they done to date? And then, especially if you have any sense of the prior experience with disasters, hurricanes in this case, often, knowing your stuff about what trauma aware or trauma informed communication might entail is also something important. We've not been trained in this. It's becoming an issue in lots of other places. But in risk communication and climate change communication, that is not yet the case. So let's stop here for a minute and just see if there are any comments or questions for Sarah or myself in the chat. So just, either unmute yourself, or if you have a question, just maybe Jack, you can also help us read it out. Sarah, if you're seeing any, just call them out. I'm just catching up now.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any so far.
Okay. Anybody want to raise their hands quickly? Otherwise, we can use that time for our interactive session later. So I just want to give you an opportunity to ask any questions for this early part, the start.
Hi, my name is Judith Weiss. I put a question in the chat box for you when you were talking about meeting resistance. And I think part of the resistance is the term retreat, which is a red flag for a bunch of people. And they would, I think, be much less having negative reactions, would be far less if we called it something else, like moving inland or moving on up, or something that has a positive aspect to it. The term retreat is full of defeat, and anybody with a military background would certainly have a really negative reaction, as do a lot of other people who don't have a military background.
It's an interesting comment and very, very common. I hear it all the time. We seem to have quite the obsession in coastal retreat conversations to think about the right R word or to avoid the R word. I was just in a session earlier where I mentioned a review of the literature that showed that the relocation literature is very, very broad, far beyond the coastal retreat one, and no other form of relocation or resettlement or retreat has any problem with that term, but we do have it in, not just in the US, but we certainly have it in the coastal context. I think the upshot from what I've learned from that literature is that, it goes back to one of the points we just made, which is you want to know what is the local vernacular, what is the language people use to talk about this or not talk about it yet. But I also, feel like sometimes we reinforce this taboo by not using the term. The more important part is the story, not the word. You can certainly shut down the conversation if that's all you do. But the story, which is also what we want to do here in this session, is to really frame this as that one part in a story of transition or transformation. And this is just a beginning of that process. It doesn't end there. Loss or ending is not the end of the story. And I think that's a really, really important piece. So, there is no one description for it. If moving upward or inland or whatever works for you, fabulous. There are many places where retreat works. There's problems with any flavor of this. And I think the more important part is maybe to start with listening and seeing how the community talks about it. I don't know, Sarah, if you want to mention how in your community people talk about it or not.
I will when we're getting into the next section. So
Okay.
if you want to begin that would be great.
Yeah, why don't we just do that?
Yeah. So after that first session, it was a lot, and I alternated between not wanting to work on it at all and analyze any of the report, and then also coming up with a lot of really great ideas for what could we study, because we knew that people needed to know more information, because ultimately their goal was to figure out how much time they have. And, in my conversations with people that, we never really talked about leaving, even though people kind of said that implicitly. There was an undertone in all of the conversations, kind of in, we'll kind of know when time's up. And so we knew that we needed to do a second session and wrap up all of the missing links. And so we finally did that in December. And that was a very intense, almost 2-hour long workshop, which is a lot over Zoom. I think you all know that. And after, as we were closing that up, I said, most communities have the luxury of time to plan before they implement the plan. And Kildare Beach, unfortunately, was going to need to implement as it was planning. And they were really grateful for that honesty, but they were also kind of like, oh, we don't even know what that means, because we don't even know what planning looks like. And, I actually was kind of overwhelmed by the entire session and trying to figure out how do we begin writing a report that was going to be valuable. And so I still didn't sit down and do it for a few more months. And I also felt that there was just a lot of extra pressure on my shoulders than would typically be on my shoulders for writing something like this, because this needed to be a report that was easy to read and understand, and that made a lot of sense at a level that was not talking about risk assessment. And so we needed, we needed more resident input, but we haven't gotten to that point yet. So, during that time, I was also connecting researchers with the community to see if we could get grant funding that could also have graduate student work that could get them the kind of hydrological modeling and studying that they needed, and figuring out how could we visualize this, that people could really start figuring out what was the next step and how much time they would ultimately have. And so, as we're doing this, I just, helping that connection was something that I felt like I could do in the process, because I felt pretty helpless. In April, I finally set that initial draft, and in May, I finally got to actually go to the town to visit for the first time. And after about 2 hours of driving around this rather small place, it still took me 2 hours. I then spent another almost 2 hours in the administrator's office, just talking and getting to know each other and understanding where we were coming from, and building that relationship, because that relationship is absolutely essential to this work. And, his comment to me was, look, we know we can't stop this, but we want to find ways to buy people more time. And he was focused on trying not to scare people such that they sell their houses. because he's also worried about the tax base, which is already eroding while, you know, the municipal costs are starting to increase. Property values are going down in this place. And then in the middle of it, he just randomly said, you have a really depressing job. And, you know, if any of you are aware of like how the culture is in South Carolina and the South, there people are not really blunt or very direct. There's a lot of really creative euphemisms that go around. But, you know, he kind of just kept going on and on telling me how depressing my job was. And I'm like, yeah, dude, I get it. You know, you're not wrong. But then I realized that was his way of expressing his feelings about this, how overwhelming it was and how helpless he feels. And I told him that, you know, what we're here to do, what we do now, you know, what we do in Kildare Beach, how they approach these problems and how they think about this and how their community comes together. All of that is lessons learned for everybody else that's going to go through this afterward. You know, he kind of thought about that for a few minutes and he said, I guess you're right, but it really sucks to go first. And that's another like really blunt statement that you just don't get out of people in South Carolina. And I realized that I really needed to shift the tone in that conversation and help him begin thinking about what comes next, rather than focusing on the loss and the depressing stuff. So I asked him just a random question that I ask a lot of people when we're talking about this topic. What are the two most important things that you need to have in order to be able to actually live in a place? And I let him hem and haw about it. And we ended up laughing a bit, making really bad jokes. And I finally said, you have to be able to get there and you have to be able to flush the toilet. If you can't do either of those, you can't live there really and truly. However you do that, however creative you get, that's you know, that's you know, that somehow, as long as you can happen, that's how you can buy time for people to live in a place. And that opened the conversation up to all levels of creativity I hadn't seen out of him. He knew stormwater engineers, he knew wastewater engineers, he knew all these people. Are like, oh, I wonder if this is possible. I wonder if this is possible. And because he's really thinking about these very vulnerable neighborhoods that really are already flooding and their septic systems are already failing relatively frequently. And you know, knowing that, you know, figuring some stuff out, maybe that they could give them 10 years or they could work together to buy them 15 more years. And we know that the future is not pretty. We know that, you know, people are ultimately going to have to come to that decision themselves. This is not a community that is ultimately going to qualify for government aid under the current funding structures. And you know, but there's a lot we can do. I don't know what that is, but there's a lot that we can do over the next 10 to 20 years, and maybe we can work together to help figure that out. And we'll be going to public engagement later this summer and hopefully have a final draft due by the end of the summer. And I'll be presenting the findings to City Council this fall. And the goal of this is ultimately to open up a conversation.
Great, thank you. This is really cool. So I'm going to do the same thing as I did before to try to break down the story that Sarah just told. And when we prepared this, we really thought, you know, this is really an arc of a conversation from starting it to just deepening it into it and then changing the conversation over time. But they're really important steps that she took in this process that I observed. And you can probably resonate with that in your own conversations with communities that you work with. This first piece here now about visiting in person, getting to know the place, getting to know people, building relationship, and from the get-go, affirming they're not behind, right? It's not necessarily good news to be on the front of the bleeding leading edge of this, right? But in some ways, it makes their efforts, their strains worth it for everybody else, right? It already is a meaning-making effort right there. And then, of course, you know, building that trust, learning to speak their language, you know, even understanding that when they talk about your job, they really talk about their job. You know, these very interesting subtleties here that are in there, learning, you know, how they talk about it, what's taboo, what nobody can talk about, and getting really clear about what help do they want, because you might come in and think, oh, here's what I'm going to help them with, and they don't want that. They're not ready for that. They have to really own the conversation. Let them drive it. So you being there to listen and to ask questions that essentially move things along is really important. So then, you know, what is it that whether or not where the services are already being disrupted, where the vulnerabilities are, where things are falling apart, what their experience is, that's all sort of how you begin that conversation with pretty much This is what they know. This is the stuff they're confident about, if you will. And then you begin to infuse that conversation with some of the science. In this case, modeling that shows, and realize that this interesting step from talking first to just the town manager, and then talk to a broader set of staff, and then eventually it's going to go to city council, and then eventually that means it's going to go public, right? So there is a sequence to that. And really then explaining it until they get it. The so what, not the what, the so what. And very closely observing what are their reactions. It's really important to mirror that back to people and reassure them that you help them through that conversation. They're not going to be thrown in front of the wolves, right? That you're going to be there, not just with the technical information, but actually to help them navigate and build that conversation, build a similar kind of trusting conversation with the public and the elected officials. So, and even, going for a walk together, taking a drive together through the town and seeing, can we ground truth this information that we had, together identifying what gets in the way of acting, but also really directing them toward the future. What is it that they can do to basically buy themselves time when it's, really inevitable that eventually they have to go. And then the last bit here, sorry, I'm getting off my arrow, is this changing the conversation from, this is the end of it, oh my God, it's terrible, it's, we're going to lose, all that kind of conversation, toward really engaging their creativity and their, just all their ideas, however off the rocker they might at first seem, of how might they enable themselves to have the essential conditions for staying in place a bit longer. And of course, eventually also developing the options of how do we move back, where do we go, how do we restore the place that we're leaving, right? So this is where you begin then to reframe the retreat as a transition in this process to something that's actually possibly better. As I said in this earlier presentation, we always have an opportunity with retreat to actually build the kind of community we want. We don't want to just relocate the problem. We want to end the problem and solve it in a new place. So facilitating that visioning, that's sort of what I'm beginning after all this time. Now, obviously delayed with COVID, but after all this time, they're just now beginning at this place of facilitating a vision. So again, I want to stop for a minute and just see if there's any questions. Put them in the chat or just simply unmute yourself and speak. And Jack, if you see anything that I missed in the chat, please shout it out. Klaus, yeah, you raised your hand.
Yeah. What do you do to get the upland portions of a community to support the community in the buyout in the lowlands? Because they only see the property taxes going up. That's sort of what they seem to be interested in or trying to avoid. And so they nevertheless elect the officials, those who have to manage this and ultimately have to make some tough decisions.
Yeah, it's a great question. Sarah, do you have a suggestion on that one?
I think it's beginning a conversation that also incorporates them. That, when you have a conversation about buyouts, you're usually just talking to the people that are subject to the buyouts. You're not talking about the rest of the community. And that this kind of conversation needs to begin now. That needs to be part of the community fabric and culture, if you will. And that, as you start bringing those folks in, helping them realize that they're part of the success for everybody else may help that, help that transition work.
I think the only thing I would add is, I now live in an inland community, and I've been trying to get the conversation started here about being essentially a haven for lots of the eventual migrants from the coast. And what I've learned so far in that conversation was that the community and the region actually has gone through an exercise after, I think it was after 9/11, where, you know, there was very suddenly an influx of people from New York City. And the local community was completely overwhelmed with where to house all these people, even if it was just temporarily. Eventually, I think that subsided, but, you know, the same happens after hurricanes. Sandy was another one of those instances. So there is an experience locally there of having to think about this. And again, this is, I think, very much the same process of getting to know the community, understanding the language, understanding the sort of preoccupations that they have. Most of them do, you know, think, oh, we're so far from the coast, it's never going to affect us. And yet there is some experience there that you can tap into as the beginning template. It's not the full one, right? But it's at least they have some experience you can tap into to start that conversation. There's a case in Louisiana that has really done, I think, exemplary planning, both with the leaving community and the receiving community, of how to, you know, accomplish relocation and look at both ends of that journey. So that might be something to look into if you're interested, to explore how they did it there. So in the interest of time, maybe we can just go on. There's another hand, so let's quickly do Carly, and then we'll go to the next piece.
Hi, it's mostly just a quick little comment that I want to add for Sarah in the kind of depressing aspect of her job. So I did my undergrad at College of Charleston, and I graduated in 2019. So I was around for the 100-year rain event in 2015, and I had to evacuate every single fall for a hurricane. And just in those 4 years, there was a significant increase, just anecdotally, of flooding and these extreme storm events. And I think that Charleston and the Charleston area and the coastal Carolinas are, you know, they're kind of at an inflection point where things can get really bad really quickly, or provide an example on to a national audience of, you know, mitigation, adaptation, and retreat, and how it can be done and be done well. I think there's just so much potential in Charleston for that, because it's a thing, and also because it's a tourist destination, and people want to go there, and they want to see Charleston for all its beautiful beaches and rather troubled history. So I just want to say, don't get discouraged. I'm very depressing. I totally agree. Anything in climate is kind of depressing, but I think there's just such a good opportunity for Charleston to set a precedent for the whole country and coastal regions across the globe.
I fully agree with you on that. And so with that, I'm actually going to go into the next segment with Susie. So one of the things that we're really learning in this as we're going along, I don't really work with Charleston. I work with other communities. I tend to work with communities that don't have the capacity, and so we're able to add that capacity and that technical expertise that they really can't afford. But one of the things that we're really learning as boundary communicators is that this is not a science communication job, and that we're necessarily communicating, here, have some more science. It's becoming more about how do we hold your hand and support these conversations, and how do we translate the relevant science and the so what of that, and so that it's resonating, but it's also connecting down to what decisions do you have to make, and what are the numbers you need to make those decisions. And it's also now becoming about supporting their emotional responses and needs. And I am not a counselor, I am not trained as one, but more and more, I am finding that that's the kind of training that I need on top of all of the science communication work that I'm doing. I'm also not trained in visioning, and that's what I also need to learn to be able to do. People need time to process this, communicators included. You know, we thought we could do a really fast process with this, because it's also taking me time to really think about what are we doing here, and finding the the ability to communicate what we need and figuring what are the right things to do at this time. You know, you don't have to have all the answers. You know, stop thinking like you do. Just because you're the quote unquote expert in the room doesn't mean you know everything. And you know, that's definitely not going to mean you know everything about the community. That's where they need to tell you what's going on. And that's what they need to tell you about what's important. And you know, this comes through that process of working together. I've also learned that as experienced as I am with communicating with the public, I feel like I don't have the confidence that I need to communicate the really bad news. Like you can communicate the general stuff, but when we're coming down to your backyard, it becomes a little bit more challenging. And then, you know, one of the things that, you know, Susie and I have kind of discussed is that, you know, this quote unquote frontline work is really hard on people. And so is there down the line for all of us that are in this kind of work, do we need to have somebody that we can rotate on and off with so that we can take a break and, you know, maybe not be thinking about the, you know, the really bad stuff, so that we can have a break, maybe doing less, you know, more positive focused stuff to kind of recharge ourselves. And, you know, also that question of, am I the right person to be facilitating this conversation? I am not trained in grief work, and yet I now feel like I have to be a grief worker without letting people know I'm a grief worker. So Susie, your turn.
Yeah, I think I want to actually skip my own story or just say very briefly that part of my own journey into this is that I at some point felt like I needed to become a conflict mediator. I took training then in conflict transformation in particular, and it's a particular approach to that topic that lives on the premise that the parties know best what they want. And what I confronted myself with is that I actually didn't believe that. Not in this country. It's not my experience. And I just simply learned as I went through that this is not, at least that particular approach is not one that I feel like I can even stand behind. So I think I just simply want to tell that story as, you know, there's going to be a lot of things you think you need, and you need to really come to own it so that you can actually live it well in a community and exhibit all the you know, skills and practice them. This is, I mean, as much as you need to learn as you go and accept that, conflict is also a really, really tough thing to be thrown in the middle of as a novice. So I just simply, you know, want to acknowledge that some things are simply going to be really tough to do. And let me move on to this next bit here, just to sort of move us along and get into an interactive session. What we talked about so far is, you know, these sort of stages of this process, right? From how Sarah opened the conversation, and then, you know, at some point, and we're still not there, right? They're not yet retreating in this community, but at some point you come to the place where you actually have to be in the middle of managing the change and communicating through that. And at some point, the people in that town, and maybe you with them, are going to be the last ones to turn the lights off, essentially. What are the tasks in that? What are the issues? And what I think is interesting about that is, in the beginning, it seems like we're all focused on the science of things. There's a lot of the social dynamics you have to be aware of, and absolutely the psychological one. Over time, once this gets really down to brass tacks, it is political and it's going to be legal. And again, I think continues to be psychological all through. And at some point, when people simply run up against physical limits, or simply that they can no longer afford to, you know, whatever, hold the line, if you will, it becomes an economic issue. It's not like the economics don't play a place, but in terms of actually getting to the place where a community says we can't be here anymore, that's physical and economic more than anything. And that comes with its own set of psychological issues. So what do? What is the role of you as a communicator? In the beginning, it's breaking the news, you know, building, maintaining the social capital among everyone involved, helping to process the emotions, facilitating this process of buying time, developing alternatives, dealing with paralysis, you know, that people just don't want to deal with it. Then it gets into really facilitating difficult dialogues and potentially conflict mediation. Maybe you're going to be in the middle or caught somewhere in legal proceedings. And what is your stance there? Are you going to then drop it, or where are you going to be with that? How comfortable are you in the middle of that? What is, your organization's ability to be in that? But how can you continue to work, even in such a litigative context, to work with the willing and helping them process whatever is coming up for them? And then the issue really becomes like helping people face limits and the emotions that come up with that, communicating through the relocation process, recreating the social fabric somewhere else and helping people heal from the loss of what they just went through. So this is what we're talking about right now, is just that on the left-hand side of this. I think we're gonna have to learn a lot more about what comes after that. So what we're gonna do now is actually getting you all to talk. We're gonna go into breakout rooms. We have 65 people, and it's just an opportunity for you to sort of, to help you recognize where the retreat conversation is, wherever you're working. As I said, it could be any context. And when that conversation is ready to shift into its next phase. And the way we're going to do this is you're going to be going into a breakout room, randomly assigned. And in the chat, this probably already happened, we're going to put links to Jamboards. So if you say you're breakout group number 3, you're going to click on the link for the Jamboard for breakout group 3. Okay, so you brainstorm on 4 questions. There isn't going to be a leader officially, just self-organize, please. You're all adults and can do that. So you brainstorm on 4 questions. I'm going to say something about that in a minute, and then just discuss it. You have about 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and have about 10 minutes for debrief. The 4 questions that you're going to find, this is what it looks like. You're going to see here, those are the 4 questions. What do you think where your community is at right now? What's going right? What's happening not yet? Where are the sticking points? The second question is, when have you noticed shifts in the conversation? Really subtle things. What does that sound like? What does that look like? What does it open up or close down? And then the question, what have you done to help make these shifts come about? And what more do you need help with? The way you do that, I'm sure you've all done it. There is this little icon there, the 4th one down. You click on it, you get a little sticky note. You can pick your color if you want that. You write down your text, and then you click save, and then it shows up. I just give you an example here. If we haven't started yet, but I'm noticing people want to have the conversation, right? That's just an example. And then if you just all run out of space, you can resize your stickies, but if you need more space, just, click on this top thing there, and then you have basically more space to put stickies. But you can also just stack them on top of each other. Don't take all the time just to brainstorm, just have the conversation. So 20 minutes total. And I think with that, Jack, can you move us all into breakout rooms, please?
Just before we go in, Jack, can you put all of the breakout group links into the chat so that everybody has links to it? There's going to be 6 breakout rooms. And Susie, you may get accidentally put into one, so you know how to leave.
Yep, that's all good. Yep.
Okay.
Great. So
you ready,
we'll
Jack?
So you just want 6 rooms?
Yes.
All right. One moment.
All right, we're gonna go. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Does everything seem good?
Yeah, looks like. I think the 3 that are in here just may have forgotten.
I think one of them came in like right. Let's see, honest.
Heidi, Tasha, Trisha, you there?
other screens are just blank for me.
All right.
Susie, you stayed.
I stayed. Yes, it was fun. Let me share my screen again and then we can return.
Okay. Everybody
right.
will be brought back in here in 15 seconds anyway.
Okay.
So
Great. So let everybody breathe for 15 seconds.
yeah, so you guys had 20 minutes to kind of dive into these questions. Is anybody, we can't share with everybody, can't have everybody share because we only have about 4 or 5 minutes, but does anybody want to share anything, any kind of aha that came out of your breakout discussion? You can just click your hand raise and we'll call on you. Or you can just unmute.
Just one highlight. Don't you all speak at the same time?
Well, Susie, you could go.
No, I'm talking all the time, but I'm happy. We had great conversation about group. So anybody from my group, if you want to share a piece from your insights that you gained. Well, let me just say in general.
Emily, just raised your hand. Do you want to talk?
Great.
I can talk. I joined the session late, but I really appreciated, I believe it was Christina at the end that mentioned about long-term heritage. So this is something that we're thinking about. I'm joining from Canada, from East Coast Canada. It's something we're thinking about here too. And Christina, from what I understand, is located in Germany. Definitely different context, different historical heritage context. But where I'm joining from, there's a long, like since time immemorial, there's an indigenous heritage and indigenous cultural practices along the coast. But there's also settler history for the past like 400 years. And so I thought thinking about deep time and like long heritage pieces, I thought that was noteworthy and stood out to me.
Okay. Thank you for sharing, Emily. Anybody else want to chime in from their group?
Each community is its own. It's very hard to generalize any lessons that go beyond the local conditions.
Okay, thanks for sharing. Anybody else?
In general, in group,
I'll just
really early.
continue from our group, I guess. I just want to say most of us in kind of the first part, which was like, oh, like where's your community at right now with retreat and resilience? You know, it seemed that most people in our group kind of, you know, it's some people are talking about it, like it's not an obvious issue yet, but there's kind of this, you know, collective anxiety that it is going to be a problem eventually and that we're going to have to do something about it. And it's kind of I guess the next step is how can we take those aware and anxious individuals and kind of get that message out there that, you know, maybe we should do something proactive and kind of address these issues before they become too big to handle.
Thanks so much for sharing, Carly. Susie, did you want to chime in before you went on to the next?
No, I think she just said what I was going to say, that how early we still are, but I see David K raised his hand. So David?
Well, just to, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry. So just to expand on, was it Carly? Whoever just spoke, just said, you know, our sticky note said, about that first point. Rural communities are in denial and unwilling to discuss retreat or location. So that was one of our experiences. Another one, most of the communities I work with do not see retreat as something that they need to do. They have other adaptations short of retreat that seem more appropriate to them, at least for now. And I just wanted to make the point that this is not consensus or anything from the group, but for most of these people, this issue is embedded in a lot of other risk management decisions about, you know, other issues, including other climate change issues that, you know, that condition how they think about these things.
Great, thanks for sharing. Do we want to hear from Ruby and then we'll go to Susie, or do we want to just go to Susie?
No, let's hear from Ruby and then we go on.
Okay.
Hi, I just wanted to respond. I didn't mean to cut that thread. I agree David, what you were saying, but respond to Carly in terms of that's my experience as well, that some people are having that conversation, and even I've done a vulnerability assessment where it was this, you know, people were very involved in that in this one community, but the struggle for me is, do those some people represent the whole, or do we need everybody, or is it okay to have a few change makers, and how does that get to the equity issues? Because a lot of times those people that are participating have the time and you know, they maybe have less things going on. I mean, I'm totally assuming, but you know, there's just a wider population that needs to be involved, and how do you reach them? So that's sort of where I'm at.
It's a great point, Ruby. And I think, you know, it actually helps us a little bit move on to this last bit here, which is really about, you know, so often when we are trained in communication, we're told to essentially message whatever we have to say, and push that as many times as we can down the throats of people. And, you know, what you're raising is that there's no audience, first of all, to hear it yet, right? And we have to go to them rather than expecting them to find us. And I think, you know, the tone of that, and I think we heard it early on in some of the earlier sessions today, is really about listening to what the concerns are, and being in that dialogue with people so that we can situate, you know, where is the conversation? Where are people hung up? Where are they in the emotional journey that they're going to go through? What are their concerns, their issues? And you know, particularly when there are all these other issues that everything is entangled with, whether it's, you know, the economics of a community, the racial history, the culture of the place, and so on. So I guess it was really important to Sarah and me that we would basically say to you, you know, this isn't about messaging. This is probably the biggest break with traditional communication. Instead, you know, to recognize that you often, as a person living in your communities, you're part of it, you're in it, you live it and feel it just as everybody else. And you're navigating it together, fighting over it together, working it out and creating it together. And I think that's a very different stance. And I think a very different investment than if we're just here to write the pamphlet, write the message, do the press release, right? We're really creating community and creating a change in our community. And I think that gets a lot more difficult and much more engaged, and maybe because of that also much more rewarding and interesting. I want to say a couple of words here about this notion of, you know, the depressing job that Sarah has, or that some of us feel we have, the news being rather dire. What I've learned over time is that, you know, any cheap hope is just not going to cut it for this process. It often begins with this clear-eyed diagnosis that is delivered with empathy, and think of this really as, imagine you're the grief worker, as Sarah said, or you're the doctor who has to deliver bad news about your health, right? you have to give that news with empathy to the patient, if you will, and then co-design with them a vision of what is a worthwhile outcome. Maybe you'll be totally well again. Maybe you're well somewhere else. Maybe, you know, you have to completely redo your life, right? But maybe there's even, you know, the outlook is not good. There is an ending, but how do you want to end where you are at? So what is a worthwhile outcome for the community that you're working with? Maybe it's about maintaining the community. Maybe it's about, you know, keeping your job, having good school for your kids, whatever the case may be. How do we get from where we're at to that place? What's that feasible path? And what can I do as a resident? What can I do as a communicator? What can I do as an elected official in that process? You know, so this sense of we're doing this together. There are gonna be setbacks along the way. Maybe a storm comes through, maybe sea level rises faster than we thought. Maybe there's a new discovery that we haven't made yet of where, you know, the impacts are showing up. Maybe something we tried isn't working, like, you know, nature-based solutions or whatever. And you might also achieve interim goals, and people might just feel like, okay, now I can go and do something else and focus on, but obviously the issue is continuing. So what is your strategy for those moments when people are sort of ready to tune off? Always creating a sense that we're doing this together, and because it's going to be hard, it needs to be anchored in something that is truly meaningful and lasting, a very deep motivation for people to stay with it. And I guess I just simply want to say this is a recipe that I offered to Sarah at one point, and at least you can speak for yourself, Sarah, in a moment here. But you know, this has been super helpful to her in trying to bring and speak from that authentically to and with the community. So, Sarah, it's back to you then.
You know, I kind of want to just begin on that doing it together part. But I feel like when you are coming to a community with this level of news, that they kind of feel like they're alone, or that they have to do it alone. And that's, you know, part of that is our culture, that we have that individualistic culture that everybody kind of has to, we have to do it ourselves. And as I was working with the administrator, you know, as we were really getting into that creative part, I was talking about, you know, maybe the town does this, but the residents agree to do this. And this is how they participate, and that everybody has a stake in keeping themselves there for as long as they can and recognizing what that is. And that I also just go back to that hope recipe relatively frequently when I just need a moment to, you know, kind of remind me of, you know, that I'm, you know, there is a way forward, and that, yes, it seems kind of, you know, vague, but it really is there. And that has been very helpful for me. And that Susie also has, you know, one of the things that's also helped me is that Susie telling me that she finds hope in uncertainty. That when you're like in the whole side of everything's gonna be fine or we're totally screwed, you're really convinced of that. There's no room to actually do anything. But if you don't know what's going to happen, there's actually a lot of hope in that, and a lot of you know, a lot of positive forward motion in that. So you know, just a little bit of that self-care component, because you know, if you're a communicator doing this kind of work, it is hard on you. We spend a lot of time, I think, you know, trying to figure out how to do this, and also being really hard on ourselves. And so I just wanted to give over a few, you know, self-care, you know, things that I have learned. Yes, the two things that are on there, I think everybody tells you, and, you know, it is true. I don't know that I need to tell you any of this. Let's go to the next one, Susie. You know, debriefing with people, talking with people, your colleagues, your friends, a therapist, a counselor, anybody. Talk about this, you know, even if it's talking about coworkers, you know, they'll be happy to hear this, but also remember that they're going through this as well. You know, really important to build your listening skills and really learning how to mirror those conversations, and that's so you can work with people and be able to help them. But also important to ground yourself and prepare yourself and before you're going into these conversations, so it's not coming through you and sticking to you, it's kind of running through you like a willow tree. And then, you know, practice staying authentic, and that, you know, don't come in there trying to be something else that you know, this, you know, version of you. Be yourself, come in there, because that's what people connect with. Recognize when you're tired, you know, take breaks, you know, whether that's the place or the issue, or even just work. If you have leave, use it, you know, that's what it's there for. And then, for that larger, if you're an employer, look at, how to train others to do your jobs so that you can swap people who are doing this frontline work around, if possible. And then the last one is that, this is probably the most important thing that I've learned in this. You do not have all the answers. You do not have to know all the answers. Even if you are the expert that is brought into the room, you don't know everything, and it's okay. You're there to learn along with and support the staff, and you're there to help them facilitate this conversation. You're not leading the conversation. And that, inevitably, we're always worried about getting attacks. And that's because all change is really hard and there's resistance and people are reacting to that. You just happen to be in the way. So it's not about you, it's about the topic. And so just a few notes on final reflections. We have a few minutes to talk about this, but I did want to address Ruby's question about who participates and how do we get people to participate. I don't really have a great response to that because I think it's also dependent on the issue, but that's one of those critical questions that you ask for engagement. How do we get people involved? Who should be there? But a lot of how people decide to be involved is what's in it for them. Do they see their views and their points of view actually resulting in something? Do they feel like they're going to be valued and welcomed? And yeah, we kind of talk to the same people all the time, but how do we branch out and work with other people, and how do we invite others into the circle and into the conversation? And that's a question that you kind of have to answer for yourself, but think about it more deeply. And I'm very happy to chat with you offline and kind of think about that. Susie, is there any kind of final reflection you want to add to this?
Well, I guess, we've mostly focused on sort of the communication in the communities that eventually will have to retreat, partially or wholly. We have not spoken a lot about what it means for the receiving community. It came up just a little bit about maybe how to begin those conversations. I think there's some similar elements and also clearly some differences. I mentioned, I don't know if Astrid is still there. Yeah, you are. You mentioned the fact that, temporary influxes is not the same as permanent. You're absolutely right about that. And I think, it is at least a way to say, you've already once thought about this. You already started to think through how would you, deal with a surge. Now let's tap into maybe your long-term planning experience. Some communities, pride themselves in actually being forward-looking. Maybe there are ways in which you can tap into the culture of the place, of being, I don't know, a welcoming city. There's Anna Morandi always reminds me, and Anna, you should speak up about the welcoming, what's it called, Anna?
Welcoming America. It's a really amazing organization that essentially they're not climate related. They don't necessarily work on climate, but they have created a checklist for receiving communities who are interested in welcoming refugees and immigrants. And it's this really impressive framework. I highly recommend, if folks are interested, if you just look up Welcoming America, you'll find it. It's pretty easy to find. But I'm thinking about how do we adapt something like that to serve receiving communities for internal domestic relocation and migration.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. That's really important and a great resource. I've looked at it and I find it very, very helpful. And I think this is, we just as we're just at the beginning of this conversation, I think it's looking for the moments of readiness to have that conversation. I think COVID has created some really interesting openings and angles on this, especially in rural areas that are all of a sudden having this enormous development pressure. So, that there are ways maybe in which we can use these as analogs as a way to at least open the conversation. But I'd love to hear I know we're essentially out of time, but if anybody still wants to, just mention something or put it in the chat, please do. And if you are jumping off, thank you so much for being here, for joining us. And also both Sarah and I would be happy to be available for further conversation. So we just put this last slide up while you guys, if you still want to speak, just so you have our contact information. So feel free, just jump in if you feel like it. All right, I guess I see people are leaving. So thank you all for being here. Wonderful session with you all, and enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you, Susie and Sarah.
Thanks, Anna. Talk to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
I will try to find the recording. Do you guys want me to email it to you guys?
I don't need, but if it goes on the conference website, that would be great.
Okay.
I would love a link if you have it. That would be great.
Link. Okay, I will do my best to find that.
Do you want to stop recording now?
Yeah, I'm going to.
Okay.
All right.
And I will stop share.